This is Nongcebo McKenzie, the podcast, where we have honest conversations that matter. We ask thoughtful questions about who we are, how we show up in the world, and the futures we are shaping together. Through conversations with thinkers and builders, we center lived experience and intentional storytelling. I'm really glad you're here. My name is Nongcebo McKenzie. Ngiyakwamukela. Welcome to the podcast. Our guests on this episode of the podcast are co-authors of the book Behind Prison Walls, Unlocking a Safer South Africa. The book is co-authored by Justice Edwin Cameron, Rebecca Gore and Sohela Surajpal, who are guests on this episode of the podcast. I'll start with you, Sohela. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
And Judge Edwin Cameron, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. And for me, it's the second time meeting you, which when you released your book, Witness to AIDS, it was 2008. And yeah, we had a beautiful chat about the book and just your views on, how the HIV/AIDS pandemic has been handled in South Africa and globally. So it's a pleasure to meet you again.
What a delight, Nongcebo, and very pleased to see that you're still on advocacy issues, whether it's AIDS or prisons or justice. Very, very pleased to be talking to you again. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Sohela, Behind Prison Walls, Unlocking a Safer South Africa. The first thing that I do when I read a book that has got images is I flip through to the pages where the images are. And when you look at the conditions, when you look at what prison is like, and you look at, these are people that have been deemed to not be fit to be with the rest of society, and they are then put in these conditions, and it's under correctional services. And you wonder how much correction can they get under these circumstances?
Yeah, it's a good point, and I'm glad you mentioned the pictures, which I do think are powerful. I think that prisons in our country are often horrific or at least very difficult places, even well-run prisons. But we have this myth in our country that prisons are like five-star hotels. And in fact, a lot of the abuse that occurs in prison happens because we don't know what goes on inside them. The public, even the media, struggle to access prisons. But all three of us worked together at our country's statutory prisons inspectorate, the Judicial Inspectorate for Correctional Services, JICS, which Justice Cameron heads. And so we had quite extraordinary and unprecedented access to prisons. We inspect prisons, we conduct investigations, we handle complaints from inmates. And so all of those pictures are pictures that we've taken during inspections of prisons. And I think they go to the heart of what we're trying to do with this book, which is to share our access and our exposure and our knowledge of what really happens behind prison walls with the public so that we can have a serious, informed conversation about our criminal justice system and whether it's working and how we treat people inside of it.
So, Justice Cameron, you would be in a position where this becomes, I would presume, a little bit tricky for you in the sense that you have obviously in your career have had to put people behind prison walls. You reflect upon an encounter early on in 1976 where that was your first time you went into a prison, but you also reflect upon a situation where you put somebody in prison and they then have stayed in touch and they've, gone on a completely different journey, and you've seen how they have redeemed themselves and how, when a person makes that decision that this is going to be a turning point in their life and they make that decision, how positively it can turn out. So for you, having those experiences, but also having been in your career responsible for putting people behind prison walls, and then you reflect, this is where I've put people based on, what they've done. It's not without reason. That for you must be quite a sort of like a tricky kind of feeling where you're feeling the empathy for where they're going, but you've also had to review their crimes.
You're putting your finger on something very sensitive and very poignant and I think insightful. And thank you very much for that question. It has been tricky, but my own past history, personal, with my father having been in prison for car theft, and as you say, with the 1976 visit to the Vereniging Women's Prison, where I met all those black women who were imprisoned under the Dr. Connie Mulder minimum sentencing Dagga laws. Mm-hmm. They left a profound impression on me. So for me, and then when I became a judge at the end of 1994, I also started visiting prisons as part of my wider judicial duties. So you're quite right. For me, it's been a complex and poignant mix where you realize, and we say this in the book, the three of us, we really talk through the issues with great anxiety. We realize that there are some people who have to be locked away for sometimes very long times. We also, in our advocacy of reform and of improvement and of finding a more enlightened path forward, we recognize that the way to curb crime is through consequences, and often those consequences will be deprivation of freedom in confined spaces, which is what prison does to one. So it is quite complex, as your observation and question rightly recognize.
So, Rebecca, chapter 3 of the book is entitled Democracy's Disgrace, Mass Incarceration. I'm curious as to why it's a disgrace.
Thank you for that question. So a big part of what our book tries to do, as my co-authors have said, on the one hand, share personal experiences inspecting prisons given our unprecedented access. On the other hand, pay tribute to what prison oversight is, which is about transparency and accountability. But at the same time, it's also a book of substance. And we put a lot of work into mapping out this history of how the current state of our prisons came to be. And so in that particular chapter, we really grapple and outline the history. We show initially the role of prisons during colonial and apartheid times as these punitive institutions that were used to effectively support the colonial and apartheid regimes. Then we show how in the early 90s, at this turn towards our constitutional democracy, we wanted to do something different with prisons. Mm-hmm. We wanted prisons to be measured by a standard of human dignity. And also, to your point that you mentioned earlier about correction, we wanted our prison system to be based on correcting behavior, not punishing behavior. And so we had in the early 90s to the early 90s, these really forward-looking progressive reforms of how prisons could be. And then, as we show in the book, there's this turning point where there was this alleged post-apartheid crime wave. We were all scared in what a democratic and integrated South Africa would be. Mm-hmm. And so through this fear, it fueled our politicians to take a wrong turn and to enforce a whole batch of what we call tough on crime policies. And so we call it democracy's disgrace because on the one hand, we have this promise, this forward-looking idea of how we can do prisons differently, but our fear distracted us and we took, I would say, a few steps back. And I think what our book aims to do is to reflect on that and to say it's not enough to have a beautiful constitution with a beautiful section about human dignity. We need to make sure that that's a living reality for people in South Africa.
So one of the things that Sohela mentioned is that people, the general public, has this perception that people who are in prison, who are incarcerated, live in a certain level of comfort. And Rebecca, when you talk about the premise of correctional services and the premise of prisons and the objective of prisons being based on human dignity, when I hear that somebody who has taken the life of somebody, who has taken the life of a honest, hardworking, tax-paying South African is now in a prison and they deserve dignity, there's a question mark that goes next to that says, okay, it's a human being. Okay, but they've done something atrocious and they've taken somebody's life and they've changed the trajectory of a family. And then, the automatic feeling as an ordinary South African is a mild rage, if there is such a thing as a mild rage, as to why would they deserve dignity. And then that is then further fueled by there are people who are out there, honest, who are desperate for a job, who are desperate for a meal, and they don't get that. But somebody who has done something atrocious can get a meal. They might get an education. There's an opportunity for an education, let me put it that way. And there's an opportunity for them to rehabilitate, learn skills. Some walk out of there with degrees, with some level of skills and so on. And that is at the cost of a taxpayer. And so when, we look at that and we think, it doesn't sound fair, because it seems that they are getting some benefit for a crime. What's your take on that, Rebecca?
It's a very important observation, and I think it's something that us, throughout our prison oversight work, we grapple with these issues a lot. Mm-hmm. And so you asked a very important and complex question, and I think instinctively, I think it's fair and I think it's justified for people in South Africa to feel enraged by crime, enraged by violence, enraged by poverty. Not even mildly so. I think it's legitimate. But at the same time, I think what happens is, in that rage, it sort of blinds us to long-term consequences and to vicious cycles that are sort of undergirding all of this. So in our book, we try and make the point, for example, that about 30 to 40% of our prison population are actually awaiting trial. Mm-hmm. So this means that these are individuals who are awaiting trial from 4 days to 4 years. They are not, they could be found innocent. They are technically innocent until proven guilty. And so what a lot of our work is doing is trying to make sure that 30 to 40% of individuals are experiencing conditions that are humane and dignified. At the same time, regarding, say, the 60 to 70% who are convicted, I think on the one hand, we grapple with the fact that some of these individuals are not necessarily committing the most violent crimes. Mm-hmm. We in South Africa still criminalize various types of conduct that shouldn't be crimes at all. We talk about drugs, we talk about sex work, mm-hmm. we talk about these types of issues. At the same time, and this is something that has come up throughout our book launches, is we're not, if we are saying that someone who is incarcerated mm-hmm. is better off than someone on the street in South Africa, mm-hmm. that's a societal problem. That's a really serious issue that us in our society need to grapple with. Yeah. And I think it also takes away the real impact of what it means to have your freedom taken away from you, to be plucked out of society and far away from your family. And the last thing I'll say, because it's such an important question, and I'm sure my co-authors will want to comment as well, is the last thing I want to say is the fact that it costs the taxpayer so much money is something we highlight in our book. And it's a point that we make to say, because it's costly to incarcerate people, we should be incarcerating them in a way that doesn't, for instance, mean that there's a revolving door and they come back into the prison system. And so the feeling of rage is legitimate and justified, but it shouldn't blind us for the reforms that we outline in our book and the various advocacy that we think would really shape the way people interact with our prison system.
And I think, Rebecca, to that point, you do break down the cost in the book as well, but to the point that you're making that one of the major issues is overcrowding in prisons. And you talk about decriminalization of some of what people are incarcerated for as a possible strategy to combat that. But at the same time, then, we have to look at the deterrent theory as well. But on the decriminalization, Justice Cameron, when we look at South Africa across various contexts, including decriminalization of some crimes, we tend to set the standard according to first world countries. We've seen on TV the prisons in Norway and the prisons in Finland, and you reflect on another country in the book where they've got essentially a casual prison system where people can leave and go to work and leave and go study and so on. But those are first world countries. And something important that Rebecca said, that, some of what we see and some of what we think and some of what we feel is very reflective of who we are as a society. And not to say that as South Africans we're immoral, but what drives crime is completely different, and what would be a deterrent is completely different. So when we talk about decriminalization and when we talk about really reconsidering and re-strategizing around correctional services, and we base that off of models that might not take into consideration who we are and how we operate and some of what drives our violence and what drives some of our social ills. Are these practical, these suggestions?
Good question, Nongcebo. And may I just go back to the question that Rebecca answered so proficiently. I think the underlying theme of both your questions, and they're both very important, as Rebecca said, is that some of this is counterintuitive. Mm-hmm. Why should someone has done something terrible, as you rightly point out, and shouldn't they be beaten into the ground? And of course, we recognize that the thirst for vengeance and for talion, Old Testamentical talion, is a legitimate. We don't decry it. We don't decry the fact that we have far fewer resources than the Scandinavian countries, the Baltic countries, which are having experiments in different forms of incarceration. But throughout the book, we say, what is going to help us to contain the terrible crime epidemic, which has been displayed on our television screens again these last few weeks with the utter breakdown, it would appear, in policing and in the prosecution services. And we say, let's go back to basics. We know that long carceral terms, we know that vicious prison conditions don't help with crime because people think they won't be caught. They think they're going to get away with it. And alas, in South Africa at the moment, they're mostly right. What does inhibit crime is the effective imposition of consequences. And that's why we say, let's reset. Whether we are a less resource affluent country than some others, we really can do things with our resource constraints. And I want to make a slightly left field point here on that, which is that under apartheid, the prison system incarcerated millions, hundreds of thousands of poor black men. We are still doing the same, more than 30 years into our democracy. And this bears on what my co-authors have already answered. That's part of the shame, that the demography of our prison population has not changed. It's just that we now have a black government that is imprisoning poor black men. And we say, unreasonably so, we say dysfunctionally so. We say there are better ways we can use the prisons that we have. There are better ways we can use the prison's budget. There are better ways that we can use the prosecuting services that we have. And we set those out in the book. So while you rightly remarked, while we were still chatting before our recording started, you rightly remarked it's a heavy read. We also believe that it's a hopeful read because we say to readers, this is what we can do. This is what is within our power, in our resource-constrained, afflicted country, our democratically aspiring but unachieved country. And that's what we emphasize. I would like to get back to drugs because it's one of our favorite drum beats, but let me pause there, Nongcebo, and thank you for that question. But I'd love to say a few words in a few moments' time once my co-authors have come in again about the drug issue.
Sure. Sohela?
I'm not sure if you'd like me to answer the question that Justice Cameron's just been speaking about, but perhaps I'll say first to the question you directed at Rebecca, to add, as Justice Cameron has said, that the indignity in our prisons is a continuation of the indignity outside of our prisons, not just in terms of race, but also in terms of class, because almost everyone we meet in prison is poor or from a resource-deprived community. We inspected a little while ago Mossel Bay Youth Center, and we met a group of children who were awaiting trial there, the youngest of whom was a 15-year-old boy. And it was clear that these boys, not just in prison, but even in their lives before that came from resource-deprived backgrounds, from communities where gangs and violence were common. And we were told by the officials there that these children were in trouble because they had been giving themselves gang tattoos. And so not only is there a continuation inside of a prison of the indignity outside a prison, but the violence and the gangs and the inhumanity inside our prisons spills out into our communities, because most of the people in our prisons will one day leave and will re-enter their communities. So if we treat those people without dignity, and if we deny them rehabilitation and a chance to remake themselves genuinely, then we in fact harm ourselves. We make our communities less safe in the long run. Rebecca often says that prisons aren't closed off places, but they're more like revolving doors where we see a continuation of our problems and where the issues inside prisons eventually spill out over. So that's another reason to care about the dignity of prisoners. On decriminalization, we speak about drugs, we speak about sex work, we speak about decriminalizing crimes of poverty and petty offenses. And the point that we're making with all of the arguments about decriminalization is that not all of our country's problems can be solved with the criminal law. Many of our problems are problems of socioeconomics. They're problems of our country's history of violence. They're problems of how we think about gender and masculinity. And maybe the criminal law sometimes has a role to play in solving those problems, but we need a much more holistic, society-driven solution, along with the criminal justice reforms that Justice Cameron has spoken about in policing and prosecuting and improving our courts. And those are things like improving our system of education and healthcare, including, when we speak about decriminalizing drugs, we also say we need to expand access to addiction services that people can rely on, because we currently don't have enough. So there are all sorts of hopeful reforms, as Justice Cameron says, that we advocate for. And some of those go far beyond criminal justice reforms.
Can we afford them, though, as South Africa? Can we afford, when we look at the cost of those in comparison to the cost of keeping people in prison, can we afford them if those resources were to be channeled in a different way?
I think we can't keep using resources as an excuse. I think we are living in times of austerity and there are genuine budget constraints. But I think to just use resources and costs is almost, I don't mean to sound punny at all, but a get out of jail card for our politicians. Because I do think what I've been trying to convey, and my co-authors as well, is this cycle that we're in. And it's a costly cycle. It's costly to society to have crime and violence so acute. It's costly to incarcerate people. I think in our book we talk about it costs around 12,000 Rand to keep an individual behind bars for a month, roughly. And so what we need to see is these costs in the long term. So if we do provide people with more dignified conditions, they won't necessarily, maybe that will give them an opportunity to start a new life when they go back out into society and then not come back in at a cost. So I guess the point I'm trying to make, and I would love to hear my co-authors' views on this, is to say it's too easy to just say we don't have the resources. But if you actually unpack the budget of the Department of Correctional Services, one could be quite savvy and strategic and think, what are costs that will be saving in the long term, so that we're not incarcerating so many people, but we're actually keeping fewer people in better conditions for shorter periods of time. And that's the main, I think, something that's a bit more nuanced and we try to unpack in the book.
On page 150, in the book, you say, recently in 2024, to answer a question posed by the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Correctional Services, JICS asked the National Commissioner for the Costs of Detaining Remand Detainees. His office calculated that it now costs the state approximately 12,125 Rand per month to accommodate every remandee, amounting to over 400 Rand each per day. That is actually more than the minimum wage per day for a domestic worker, that 400 Rand each per day. Applying these numbers, JICS calculated that the department may spend approximately 64,868,750 Rand a month just on remandees awaiting trial for longer than 2 years, together with remandees unable to afford bail of 1,000 Rand and less. The cost is staggering and imposes a massive burden to our overcrowded and under-resourced detention centres. So yeah, you articulate that very specifically in the book, Rebecca, as you were mentioning. Judge Cameron, back to you with regard to how far back the issue of drugs goes. On page 12 of the book, you referenced Dr. Connie Mulder back in 1971, who was talking about, the stricter penalties for drug use. And back then, the focus was primarily on DACA. That was in 1971. We are now in 2025. And the drug issue globally is at catastrophic level. And I include alcohol in this, which is something that you also mention in the book, stabbings in taverns. That's also related to substance abuse. But it's something that you speak about in the book quite often. And our view on it as ordinary South Africans is that it's a result of really a permissive society. Very permissive society is how we view it. But also for every single thing, generally that the public we don't like, we say, it's the Constitution. People have too many rights. People can just do whatever they want now. It was better in the good old days when people couldn't just, do this and do that and there weren't so many rights. But let's bring it back now to the issue of drugs, Justice Cameron.
Definitely, and I'd love to get to that, but please allow me two intrusive observations. Mm-hmm. The one is that we are not a poor country, we are a middle-income country. There are other middle-income countries in the world who are doing far better than we are. So we can do far better with everything, with public transport, with schooling, with feeding hungry kids. While we sit here talking on a beautiful sunny morning in Johannesburg, there are hungry kids in our country, and we can do better with prisons as well. The second quick thing I want to say, Nongcebo, before getting to your lovely question about drugs, is that calculation that has just been cited was done by my co-authors, and most of the hard facts and all the references and all the reasoning in the book comes from them. My name is first because I'm C and they are G and S. So I just wanted to slip that in. But I do want to get to the drugs question because this is definitely a preoccupation of mine. Since that day in the cold winter of 1976, when as a student I went with a then High Court judge to visit the Vereeniging Women's Prison and saw what the war on drugs, which Dr. Connie Mulder in the apartheid government imported from Richard Nixon. Of course, at the end of the 70s, there was President Ronald Reagan. He and his wife loved the war on drugs. It's been a catastrophic mistake worldwide. And if people think that listening to your podcast that I'm going to fall, no, I'm not. One of my mentors and the people I admire is President Kgalema Motlanthe. And he has joined a worldwide group of former presidents who said, stop this. You are ruining our systems of justice, our systems of prosecution. You are subjecting them to the massive bribes that these drug runners can. There are other ways, and Sohela and Rebecca have already mentioned them, which is the public health approach of Portugal. In fact, we will be saving money. We saw with alcohol and prohibition in the United States, they tried it for 10 or 12 years. It was a catastrophe. Likewise, the war on drugs, the criminalization of drugs has been a catastrophe. We recognize that fentanyl, for example, has led to an epidemic of death, which luckily now is diminishing in the States. We recognize that fentanyl is now getting into our country. So we're not naive about the dangers that drugs pose to our young people. But we make an important practical point, and that's where I'll keep quiet. The practical point, and I want to say this on record, if that doesn't sound too pompous, the drug wars of the Cape Flats, where horrific numbers of young people, teenagers, babies, young persons are being murdered, assassinated, slaughtered every day. Those drug wars will take an entirely different form. We believe they will diminish if we approached the question of drugs not solely as a criminal law question. Criminal law engenders the gangs, it engenders the firearms, it engenders the turf wars, but approached it as a public health issue and said, don't take drugs, reduce your alcohol intake, don't ever smoke, but we don't imprison smokers and people who drink alcohol. We shouldn't imprison people who use drugs either.
So on page 169 in the book, you say, community-based harm reduction in South Africa already has a positive impact. One University of Pretoria program has enabled people dependent on drugs to access medication-assisted treatment, needle and syringe services, screening and treatment for psychiatric issues, psychosocial services, trauma counseling, vocational training, and sport and recreational activities. Sean Shelley, a dedicated researcher on drug use at the University of Pretoria's Department of Family Medicine, and since 2024, Executive Director of Harm Reduction International, challenges our thinking about drugs. And you quote, "Unless we stop demonizing drugs, criminalizing or pathologizing the people that use them, and abandon the goal of a drug-free society, we will continue to be distracted from the real problems that cause many of our youth to find solutions in the dependent use of drugs." And you go on to then talk about harm reduction and treatment services that should be expanded, that you recommend should and could be expanded outside of prisons and also inside prisons as well. But, you know, when you talk about the turf wars, for example, and there the microscope is really more on the Cape Flats, but it's amazing how you find this now happening across townships in South Africa, in some rural areas even, and it's quite scary. But, you know, it's an entire value chain, and you will find that there are young people in school who are not on drugs, but who sell drugs because they don't have parents and they live, you know, they have to fend for themselves. There are some women who are heading households, and to put their children through school, they sell drugs. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just putting a context as to how some people, for them, in as much as they recognize how bad what they're doing is, they see it as the only means of survival, and they see it as the easiest thing, the quickest thing, highest returns. And when we look at it from a value chain point of view, when you say that the war or the turf wars would take a completely different dimension and direction, the flip side of that is then people would then ask, how do we then survive? These are people who are not thinking, obviously, of the negative effect, who are not thinking of the violence, the crime and everything else, who are thinking for their primary survival. And they say, well, there aren't any jobs, and I've got 5 kids to raise, or I've got to put myself and my siblings through school, and our parents died, and our grandmother died. And that's how they look at it. You know, there then is that conflict again of, I think, conflict of values even.
Yeah, no, I'd love to ask Rebecca and Sohela to come in here, but I just want to make a quick observation on the level, which is that on my street corner, 150 meters from where I'm sitting now, people are selling cigarettes, which are very harmful. Yeah. And we had a history under apartheid of shebeens. Yeah. Which were under crackdown by the apartheid police. They've been regularized partly, but vast illicit sales of liquor also occur. Yeah. So my point being that we shouldn't be scared of the fact that people rely on drugs. We should make it the subject of a public health initiative. And I know that sounds starry-eyed. It's not. We are hardly and harshly practical in the book in assessing this problem and in recommending that we change our approach.
Yes, I think if I could chime in here and just add a few points, I think on the one hand, the issue, what we're trying to get across is people rely on drugs, people sell drugs, whether we criminalize it or not.
Yeah.
What we find is that by criminalizing it and punishing people, it is just perpetuating the problem. It's perpetuating drug wars, it's perpetuating overcrowding in our prisons and inhumane punishment. I think if people don't have other economic opportunities but to sell drugs, that's an indictment on us as a society and on our government. And we should be demanding employment. And I think that's a point Sohela mentioned earlier, is that when we think about our criminal justice system and we think about what goes on in our prisons, things can't be siloed. We have to see them holistically. And so we need to be demanding more job opportunities so people can afford to get through school, to support their families. And then something else I wanted to mention is, and I think this is something that Justice Cameron was just saying, is this concern about moralizing conduct. I think we have to be careful to say we're going to judge people and give people a hard time and punish them if they choose certain opportunities. And I think what's currently happening in our society is certain things are moralized and are criminalized, and other things that are really bad for us aren't. If I may take the current example of sports betting. Sports betting in South Africa is out of control. Lately, Parliament has shown how it's impacting low-income households the worst. And yet, if one goes into an airport, if one walks or drives on our streets, sports betting adverts are everywhere. So, our proud Springboks are covered in sport betting advertising. And so I think we really have to say, should we be taking what we call in the book the blunt stick of the criminal law and punishing people who are using or selling dagga? Or should we be going over people who are systematically profiting of people having substance and addiction to whether it be alcohol, whether it be cigarettes, whether it be sports betting? And so I think these issues are complex, but the common denominator is that there are public health issues that require social responsibility, not blunt criminalization. And I'm so pleased I finally got to include a vent about sports betting, because I think it is something that is really harming our society in quite problematic ways.
Some years ago, there was a huge outcry about grandmothers spending a lot of time in casinos and the effect that was having on them mentally, socially, and obviously financially. Because there's a great proportion of it that goes back to just trying to survive, whether you're trying to survive mentally, whether you're trying to survive psychologically or physiologically, to just trying to survive. A lot of people talk about how drug use is to numb pain. If you look at the link to how of some of what is not heavily regulated or heavily punished, somehow will lead to these punishable acts.
Definitely.
And if I could make two additions to this point. The first is, if you look at Portugal, which decriminalized drug use but not drug trafficking, and which combined decriminalization with expansion of public health programs and harm reduction programs, not only did they reduce the number of people who died by drug overdose, it was a reduction of about 85%, which is enormously beneficial. But they also reduced the number of people who were using seriously harmful drugs. So I think they almost reduced it by 3/4, from 100,000 heroin users to 25,000. And so the counterintuitive point here, which is not just applicable to drugs, but to many criminal acts, is that, we've tried the harsh punitive approach. We've tried the strict sentences and the life sentences and the horrible conditions in prison, and they just haven't worked for us. But these alternative approaches that feel counterintuitive, that feel as if we're being too easy on harmful conduct, can actually reduce harm. The second point I want to make is that drugs also show us the distribution problem that we have in our prisons. So when we visited Durban Correctional Center and the Awaiting Trial Center specifically, we met a number of people awaiting trial who had been arrested for possession of drugs, but small amounts of drugs, clearly for personal possession. And they'd been granted bail of 200 or 300 rand, which they couldn't afford. They were clearly at the bottom of the food chain here, drug users, not drug lords, not gang bosses, not the white collar beneficiaries of the drug trade who drive the harm and benefited from it the most. We never meet those people in our prisons. And so the problem, not just with drugs, but with everything from organized crime to state capture, is that on the one hand, we lock up too many people in our prisons. But on the other hand, we don't lock up the right people, the people who commit the worst harms. And that is the people at the very top of the hierarchy. But it's also, for example, murderers or people who commit very violent crimes. We ran the numbers comparing over a year the number of murders that the police report versus the number of convictions for murder that the National Prosecuting Authority reports. And it's sort of a rough calculation, but we figured out that only about 11% of murders in South Africa eventually result in conviction and sentencing, which means that we are not actually holding most people who commit serious crimes accountable, but of the very few people that we do manage to convict, we then try to make an example out of them by punishing them excessively with very, very long sentences that don't contribute to their rehabilitation, that don't actually create a deterrent for crime. And that's true for drugs as well as other things.
And that's something that you talk about in the book on page 142, where you talk about the long mandatory sentences not doing anything really to curb crime, but rather suggesting that a focus on the certainty of getting caught, effective policing, effective crime intelligence, as opposed to longer and harsher sentences, which we've been talking about, the cost of that and the effect of that. But, let's talk about now the mental health situation, because for me, looking again at the images, I'm trying to count the number of beds in this cell. And something as basic as if you are, let's say you have a runny tummy, for argument's sake. Let's say you have a runny tummy and you can't control yourself. This is happening in front of 20, 30 other people. And that's a basic thing. I mean, we talk often about pit latrines, for example, and how those should be eradicated. And this is just from a dignity point of view of having to exit the house to go to the pit latrine and safety for children and all of that. We talk about that as a basic thing. Now, if this is happening in that context, we can see the dignity aspect of it. But if it's happening to people who are in prison, there's a feeling that, so they did whatever got them there. But we then need to consider what that does to you mentally. I can't even imagine how I would feel if I was in any situation where I had a runny tummy, and this is again just a basic example, in front of 20 other people. And they could all see, and whatever happened was for all of them to see. And what that does to just how I feel about myself. Now multiply that across different experiences throughout the day. You're having a nightmare, you're having a dream, maybe you're coming off of drugs, just to make that example, and this is happening in front of everyone. You can't exist in a situation where everybody can see your most private human experience. And what does that do to the mental health of prisoners, of incarcerated people?
Can I go back a few steps on Nebo, because you asked such a poignant question, and you illustrated very poignantly in a way that I think every one of our listeners this morning or this evening will resonate with them. And I want to say that we're in a debate in our country now about what sort of country we are. Mm-hmm. Are we a country of the Constitution, of legal regulation? It's in real doubt. one of the promises we made in the Bill of Rights when we adopted it 30 years ago was that we would have all people who are detained in conditions compatible with human dignity, quote unquote. And we recognize in the book that many of the promises we made in the Bill of Rights have not been substantially fulfilled. Some have been neglected more than others. We are not swinging, scathing about our prisons department. We say that it has achieved things, and we have good news stories. It's another reason not to see the book entirely as dark. We've got many good news stories about what is being achieved in our prisons. But we recognize that we haven't fulfilled the Constitution. So the point I want to make, and about the debate in Parliament and at the Madlanga Commission right now, is it's really a search for our own soul as a people. That's not a sentimental question. It is, what hope are we giving people daily that the Constitution is for them, and it's for their protection, and it's for their better provision of the material conditions of their lives? The prisons debate is part of that. So when you speak about the latrine system in prisons, I think you are spot on. And we are saying in every facet of our national life, we can do so much better with the right leadership, with the right determination, with the right civil society action, as on ARVs, to go back to where we started an hour ago with AIDS. With all of those inputs, we can do infinitely better than we're doing now and stay on the path of democracy and human dignity as we promised ourselves in the Constitution.
And you're quite correct, Judge Cameron. The images that I was referring to in the book, they also show there are prisoners who have started, and I nearly said community gardens. I would, let me just say vegetable gardens. There's a picture there, and where, that's a skill that a person might not have had before, the nurturing of a garden, the actual taking into consideration that, listen, this is something that I can do. I can sell vegetables when I get out of here. I can sustain my family when I get out of here. There are some who are sewing, and that's a skill that they might not have had. Some of them are in classrooms, you can see here. So yeah, very correct to say that there are some positive stories. I mean, the story about Glenn that we talked about when we first started is also a positive story, because some people do make a turnaround and do change their lives. But as we come to the end of our discussion, which is obviously focusing on reconsidering the configuration of our correctional services system, you suggest non-custodial sentences, you suggest harm reduction programs. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about, if we were to create an ideal future that captures the various aspects of society, where we talk about, as Sohela mentioned at the beginning of the interview, that these are people that need to be reintegrated into society. So when they come out of prison, are they coming out better? Have we really created a whole human being that can see an alternative to the way that they were living before? When we look at what other aspects of our entire social makeup contribute to high incarceration numbers, when we look at our education system, when we look at what is criminalized and what is not criminalized, when we look at what people fall into, and the term that's usually used is social ills, and what contributes to that, and consider that in the context of now reconfiguring our correctional services system. Sohela, I'll start with you. What are your thoughts on that?
There's a lot to say, and I think something we're quite proud of is that the longest chapter of our book is dedicated to reform. That's the message of hope, to say that there are real practical things we can do to make things better. And they fall into, I would say, two different categories. The first are things that we can do inside of prisons, inside of our criminal justice system. And then the second category are things that need to happen outside of our prisons. And that's what I've already hinted at. Generally reforming our society, improving people's life opportunities and life chances and access to the help that they need, so that they never have to commit crime, so that they never are in a position where they are harming others or violating the law. In terms of the first category, then, We are concerned with things like improving our policing, detective, prosecuting, and our court capacity. We advocate for abolishing mandatory minimum reforms, which not only introduced consistency to sentencing, but also made sentences much, much harsher and longer in our country, and mean that we have had, of any country in the world, the most drastic increase, an 800% increase in the number of people sentenced to life since the end of apartheid. And then we go deeper. We say in prisons themselves, let's find ways to improve people's experiences, making sure we have independent healthcare. We have access to mental health care services, to addiction services inside of prisons. We have access to sufficient rehabilitation programs, because even though prisons are meant to be correctional centers, a very small proportion of inmates actually have access to education, training, skills, work programs in our country at the moment. And then things like abolishing abusive practices like solitary confinement, like violent assault and sexual assault in our prisons. So there's a lot to say and a lot to fix in many different areas, but our message is that we can fix those things.
Rebecca, your take?
Yes, so I'm grateful that Sohela went through our core chapter that really takes reform seriously and tries to outline a way forward and various options that could be done sequentially, simultaneously, short-term, long-term. But just one point I wanted to add is, while we advocate for reform, we at the same time aren't soft. We're not soft on crime. We're not soft on accountability. Mm-hmm. And one of the main issues that we try to get across in the book is the importance of a culture of accountability. Mm-hmm. And I think that is something that, as you mentioned earlier, our chapter on democracy's disgrace, that we've sort of lost this idea that if you do something harmful, you must be held accountable. And that doesn't have to look like the way our current prisons do. But it needs to ensure that there are some measures in place that people are held accountable, but not with that blunt stick of the criminal justice system. And I think by taking the reforms in our book seriously, by considering them, we will resolve what Sohela mentioned earlier, this distribution problem. People that are driving the violence and crime should be held accountable, and people that are sort of, if I can say, your foot soldiers, need to be pivoted out of the criminal justice system and to better options.
And you say on page 196 is that some dangerous people need to be imprisoned is not inconsistent with our journey towards improving and reforming our approaches to crime and punishment. And as you were saying, Rebecca, in your recent comment, that you were saying that it's not that you are soft on crime, but you are saying that there needs to be a system of accountability. It's just the approach to that accountability that would need to be reconsidered.
No, thank you, Nongcebo. It's been such a pleasure to chat with you and to hear your perspectives as well. And we're all very grateful.
Yes, I'd like to echo a big thank you, and thanks for engaging with our book. And I hope your podcast listeners also engage and find this really interesting and thought-provoking. And thank you for the platform to do so.
What a delight, Nongcebo. Thank you so much to you all.
Thank you for spending this time with me on Nongcebo McKenzie, the podcast. If this episode resonated with you, please rate and review the podcast on your listening platform. It really helps others to discover the show. And please share it with someone you think would enjoy or benefit from this conversation. You can listen to Nongcebo McKenzie, the podcast, on all major podcast platforms. And you can also watch full episodes on YouTube. Just search Nongcebo McKenzie, the podcast. To stay connected, follow the podcast on @NVMckenzie and @Nongcebo McKenzie, the podcast, to join the conversation on social media. You can also get in touch for collaborations, feedback, and guest suggestions. All details are in the show notes. Thank you for listening. Until next time.